Runner beans are often one of the more productive crops in my gardens, and when they are flowering they can be really beautiful. They're quite similar to the more widely grown French bean or pole bean, where we typically eat the fleshy pod before the seed starts to form. But I've found that runner beans are much more abundant than the other types of beans, or at least do better in the typically cool and windy maritime climate here in Ireland. When the plants are growing well and the weather is good, they can produce a huge number of pods, and it can be difficult to keep up with them. In ways, they are similar to the abundance of courgettes or zucchini, and need to be harvested regularly before they get too big in order to get the best of the crop. I grow runner beans in 4 of my outside gardens, and the detailed records that I've kept of the harvest this year offer some insights into the differences between the gardens. And looking more closely at the details offers some interesting observations about some of the problems that occurred, and what I might be able to do to improve things so that I can get even more out of this abundant crop next season. The harvest this year ranged from about 18 kilograms in the no-dig garden to a high of more than 33 kilograms in the intensive garden, with an average of 23 kilograms per garden. That is a lot of beans, and probably more than most families would typically consume in a year, even if they preserved a lot of them. It's a bit difficult to accurately compare the yields from these gardens, as in each one of them there's a different number of plants grown in a different sized bed. Dividing the total harvest from each garden by the approximate area of the bed that the runner beans occupied changes things a bit, especially with the polyculture garden. In this garden, the runner beans were interplanted with squash plants rather than in a separate bed. So it's much more difficult to determine how much space is occupied by the runner beans themselves, so the calculations are not really compatible with the other gardens. In a way, this is also a bit of an issue with the other gardens, as the tall runner bean plants definitely overshadow the adjacent crops, so it's difficult to realistically determine how much space the runner bean plants actually took up. Dividing the yield by the number of plants in the garden gives a different and perhaps more interesting picture, with less difference between the gardens and a significant change in the yield from the polyculture garden. At first glance, it's not surprising that the intensive garden had a higher yield per square meter, as this is the focus of this gardening method. But I was a bit surprised that the yield per plant was so high. I generally plant this garden with a higher density of plants, so would expect each plant to produce less. But this season, only 23 plants survived, when I'd planned for about 30 plants in the same bed. But I'm still surprised that the yield per plant was substantially more than it was in the extensive or the no-dig gardens. Looking at the details of the harvest for this crop, there are definite spikes at different times of the year, though this is partially exaggerated by the harvest being every 2 days for a lot of the season, and with 3 days between harvests at other times. Averaging out the data over a number of days still shows definite periods of increased harvests of pods compared to other times of the year. And looking at the temperature record over this season, it is interesting to note that the higher yields often follow a warm period. This makes sense, of course, as runner beans, like many crops, grow faster with warmer temperatures, up to a point at least, but we never get that hot in Ireland. What is also interesting about the temperature record is that we had quite warm weather earlier in the season, before the plants were starting to produce pods. While this would have helped the plants to grow quickly, the pods were generally grown in cooler temperatures, and I wonder how much of a difference, if any, this would have made on the total yield. I think it would be worthwhile to try to get the plants in the ground earlier in the season, but then I would have to take the precautions necessary to protect these young, tender plants from any late frosts. The harvests from this crop were brought to an abrupt end when the entire frame was blown over in the winds that were caused by the remnants of Hurricane Lorenzo, and the same thing happened in the no-dig garden. But by then the plants were definitely reaching the end of the season and weren't producing very much at all. It was not immediately obvious to me why the no-dig garden would have had a lower yield than in the intensive garden. In both gardens, the same batch of seeds were grown in pots and then transplanted at the same date. But in the no-dig garden, there was only 1 plant per pot, rather than the 2 or 3 plants in a pot for the intensive garden. I would have thought that this would increase the chance that each individual plant would produce a better crop, but that didn't seem to be what happened. Looking at the record of the harvest from this garden, it has a profile over the course of the season that is definitely different than the intensive garden. The runner beans in both gardens started to produce at the same time, but the harvests for the first month were about 50% less in the no-dig garden. Then there was one significantly large harvest from both gardens at the end of August. After that, the yield from the no-dig garden averaged only 75% of what I was harvesting from each of the intensive garden plants. I'm not sure what caused this significantly lower yield at either end of the season, or why that one large harvest wasn't also less. There were fewer plants per square meter in this garden, but I had set up 2 tripods with 3 plants on each pole, so perhaps overcrowding of the leaves was an issue, compared at least to the repurposed construction fence that I had used in the intensive and the extensive gardens. This may have been compounded by the growing tips of some of the plants being damaged early in the season, which would have caused these plants to become bushier, which likely contributed to the overcrowding of the vines. I also wonder if the deep layer of compost that I had added to the surface of this garden had not had enough time to become available to the roots of these plants, or there was some other fertility deficiency, but this is something that I want to keep an eye on in the future. The lower yield in the extensive garden is easier to understand, as the plants were direct sown in this garden about 3 weeks after they were sown in the pots for transplanting into the other gardens. And without the warmth of the heated propagation space, the seeds in this garden would have been slower to germinate and to grow. All of this delayed the harvest from this garden for about a month, but then it abruptly caught up. And for the rest of the season, the fluctuating harvest per plant was remarkably similar to the intensive garden, though consistently about 10% less, but it is interesting that they both have the same support structure and very similar growing conditions. The lower amount of compost added to this garden may have been a factor here, but the impact wasn't so significant, as the overall lower yield was mainly due to the later direct sowing. The reason for this direct sowing is that it will theoretically lead to a stronger and healthier root system, but it didn't seem to have had an impact here. Perhaps if the season had been longer, or if there had been issues with not enough rain or irrigation, the stronger and potentially deeper root system would have improved the resilience and productivity of this crop, or at least allowed it to grow for longer. Next year I'm going to direct sow the seeds again in this garden, but I plan to do it significantly earlier to see how this changes things. The profile of the harvest from the polyculture garden was quite different. For the first week or so, there was very little difference in the harvest per plant from this garden compared to the intensive garden. Then, for the following month, until the beginning of September, the yields per plant were quite a bit higher, almost 45% more. This made sense as there was only 1 runner bean plant per pole, and this gave a lot more space for each plant, and less competition below and above ground, for the first while at least. But then the harvest dropped dramatically and continued to fall as the season progressed, indicating that something had changed. I suspect that this was because the roots of the interplanted squash plants had grown long enough to begin to compete with the roots of the runner bean plants. If there had been a lot more fertility in the soil, I wonder if this type of drop-off in harvest would have happened, or if it just simply would have been delayed. I still got a lot of beans out of this garden, especially in the first half of the harvest period, but I think it could have been a lot bigger if the plants were able to continue to get what they needed from the soil. In summary, the runner beans in the polyculture garden probably needed more fertility, and I could have side dressed or liquid fed when I noticed that the harvests weren't keeping up with the other gardens. I also had problems with damage to the growing tips of some of the plants, and I wasn't so attentive at helping the vines wind up the tripod supports, and both of these could have reduced the productivity of this garden. Some of the plants in the no-dig garden also were damaged, and I need to be more careful with this next season. Now that the large amount of compost that was added to the surface of this no-dig garden has had a chance to settle in, whatever issues there may have been at the beginning of this season hopefully won't be repeated. The repurposed construction fencing worked quite well for the extensive and intensive garden this season, and it made it a lot easier to find and harvest the beans. The key issue for the extensive garden seems to be getting the seeds into the ground earlier, which will require better protection from potential late frosts. The runner bean crop from the intensive garden seems to have been the best this season, or at least it was without the similar issues that impacted the yields of the other gardens. There are, of course, possibilities for improvement, including increasing the number or density of plants in the bed, as well as transplanting them into the garden earlier in the season, with better protection, of course. Looking at this in a broader context, the runner beans in all the gardens produced a lot of pods, more than enough for most people. They don't produce the biggest yield in the gardens, but more than most other crops, and if the beans are harvested when young and tender, then they can be a very high-value crop. This, of course, requires regular harvesting, ideally every 2 days during the warmth of the growing season. Searching for the pods and harvesting them is a time-consuming task, making up about 60 to 70% of the total time spent on this crop. It is quite a bit more time than it takes to harvest a lot of the other vegetables, but the construction frame does make things a bit easier and faster in my experience. I'd be interested in trying to find ways to get the runner beans to produce over a longer period of time, and then to grow fewer of them. In this way, I would be able to get the same amount of crop from a smaller space of land, which would allow me to grow other crops, and I'd also have the benefit of being able to have fresh runner beans over a longer part of the growing season. But as this is a highly productive crop, I often feel that I've had enough by the time the season is winding down, similar to what many people experience with courgettes or zucchini. However, if the purpose of the garden is to grow an abundance of food, then runner beans can be a really useful crop in this climate, and the more we grow, the better. But then we need to do the work to be able to store a lot of this abundance in the freezer for other times of the year, or to find some other way to preserve them, and to generally change our diets so that we eat a lot more of them when they are abundant.